And with that, I call this Planning Commission meeting to order on Monday, November 7th, 2022 at 6:02 p.m. Now I'll read the COVID protocol notice. This meeting will be conducted pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 5495-3 as amended by AB 361, which authorizes teleconference meetings under the Brown Act during certain proclaimed states of emergency. The Governor of California proclaimed a state of emergency related to COVID-19 on March 4th, 2020. This teleconference meeting is necessary so that the town can conduct essential business, and is permitted under Government Code Section 5495-3 in order to protect public health and the safety of attendees. And now we have, we'll go to the roll call, but before we do that, I think you all noticed there's a new face here. I'm not sure if Director Hamid wanted to do an official welcome, but at the last council meeting, Alexis Maple was confirmed to join our esteemed body, and she's here with us tonight. So if you hear me do a new voice or name on the roll call, that's why. So with that, I'll do the roll call. Vice Chair Lester.
Here.
Commissioner Bodie.
Here.
Commissioner Helber. Commissioner Maple.
Here.
Commissioner Polsky.
Present.
Commissioner Teal.
Present.
And I, Chair Hillis, am also here. We're also joined by Town of Moraga staff, including Planning Director Hamid, Assistant Town Attorney Murphy, Susie Melly on, that's the blacked out picture. It says Planning Department. And then we also have Barry Miller, one of our consultants, and then Darcy Kremen, who is, I believe, helped to prepare our EIR. Did I miss anyone, Afshan?
Did we call out Karen Murphy with Burke Williams and Sorensen?
We did, but we can definitely call her out twice because very important to tonight's meeting. And next to conflicts of interest, do any commissioners have a conflict of interest to report?
Don't believe I have a conflict of interest, but I do need to recuse myself for the portion where we discuss Boulder Canyon this evening due to proximity of home address.
Thank you. And we don't have an action on that item, so I don't know that you need to recuse. And Assistant Town Attorney, is he allowed to participate in the discussion?
Yes, thank you for asking. Actually, since we will be discussing the project and specifically the environmental review for the project, he should recuse, or he should step out of the meeting and then can log back in for the discussion on inclusionary.
Happy to do so.
I can text you when we're ready for the inclusionary.
All right, and seeing no other, we're on to contact with applicants. We don't have an application tonight, so we can move on from that. For the Pledge of Allegiance, I will take the liberties. Do we have our flag, or do I need my little plastic flag? There we go. All right, please repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. And now we are on to the public comment section of the meeting. This time is reserved for those in the audience who wish to address the Planning Commission. The audience should be aware that the Commission may not discuss details or vote on non-agenda items. Your concerns may be referenced to staff or referred to staff or placed on a future agenda. Note, public input will also be taken on each agendized item. If there are any public comments at this time, please utilize the raise hand feature of this webinar and we will call on you. Please remember to state your name and address for the record. You will have 3 minutes. We have one attendee and I do not see a hand raised. So with that, we will close public comment and move on to adoption of the consent agenda. We do not have any items on consent this evening. So with that, I will move on to adoption of the meeting agenda. Do we have a motion to adopt the meeting agenda?
Motion to adopt the meeting agenda?
We have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, roll call vote. Vice Chair Lester,
Aye.
Commissioner Bodie,
Aye.
Commissioner Helber,
Aye.
Commissioner Maple,
Aye.
Commissioner Polsky,
Aye.
Commissioner Teal,
Aye.
and I, Chair Hillis, am also an aye. The measure passes unanimously. And we are now on to public hearings. Receive an informational report and acceptance of public comments on draft environmental impact report for the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. I believe that staff has a presentation for this evening. Director Hamid, is there anything? Oh, and I'm seeing Director T or Commissioner Teal waving his hand. Thank you. Director Hamid, is there anything you'd like to say before the presentation?
Yes, very briefly, tonight is a public meeting on the draft environmental impact report for the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. No formal action is being taken at this meeting. It is intended to provide the public an opportunity for public comment for a 45-day period, which began on October 27th, and it ends on December 12th at 5 p.m. The Planning Commission will be asked to make recommendation on the draft EIR in 2023, January 2023, after the final EIR has been prepared. I do want to let you know that we did put in a notice in the paper. We've also notified over 75 different agencies and other jurisdictions that we work with. We've also put this on social media. We've sent it out via Notify Me. We've also put it on the city's webpage and also a banner. So we've done extensive outreach just on this. So with that, I want to introduce Darcy Kramen, who's with Rincon Consultants and is the lead on the environmental impact report. And then our consultant, Barry Miller, is also here. And I will begin with the first couple of slides. I will do a brief introduction. So thank you for being here tonight. Tonight's meeting, as stated, is on the draft environmental impact report, which is an important component of the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. Next slide. So the project is really many tiers. It includes the Bollinger Canyon area, which has been a study area. It includes general plan amendments. It includes a safety element. It includes objective design standards. And also, we are trying to address the RHNA. And as discussed over the last year, most of the RHNA will be addressed through the Moraga Center and the Ream Center areas. We are required to provide 1,118 units. We're not required to build those units, but we are required to zone for the units. We have a 45-day schedule for the project. The comments end on December 12th at 5 p.m. The public can go ahead and submit those comments to me, Hamid at moraga.ca.us. We also have that up on our website. The entire EIR, the draft EIR is available. And I will let Darcy basically discuss the draft DIR and the analysis. There have been multiple reviewers in this. So the town staff has been robustly involved, including myself and our planners, Brian Horn and Mio Mendez. Barry Miller has also been extensively involved in this, and then Darcy Kramen. But I do want to say that this whole effort, we did reach out to several of our reviewing agencies, and several of our departments that we work with as well, including police, MOFD, Public Works. We reached out to many of the other agencies that we collaborate with, like East Bay Mud, PG&E. So we have taken a lot of care to look at the analysis and to incorporate feedback from those agencies. Thank you. So yes, the draft EIR is available at makemoraga.home.org. And we're also taking public comments. And with that, I will turn it over to Darcy to go through the presentation.
Thanks, Afsha. So very briefly, I wanted to tell you what was the project that we studied under the CEQA document. California Environmental Quality Act requires us to have a stable project description for us to analyze. So the first component, if you would, Barry, is the housing element. As Afsha mentioned, it has to be updated every 8 years, subject to this whole state certification. And as Afsha mentioned, Moraga has a fair share of 1,118 units, including the 501 affordable units. So that was one element that the CEQA document studied. Next slide. We also looked at the rezoning of the entire town. So it's just a mechanism to provide more available sites to build the affordable housing and up to the number of units. So it's enabling developers to come in. So we wanted to look at what could be done under the development, the new rezoning. So we looked at very specific sites and we looked at a very specific number of units that could be built on those sites. Next slide. We also looked at general plan amendments because the general plan was adopted in 2002. So it's pretty old. Some of those new policies will go into addressing safety, evacuation, and traffic and such. So we looked at the policies that were drafted, and also just because we needed to do some internal consistency. And lastly, we did analyze Bollinger Canyon, the study area rezoning. Sorry, next slide, Barry. So it's a very large area, as you know. We looked at what could be built under this proposed rezoning. And again, this is the project and you'll be discussing this at length, but this is what the EIR analyzed. Next slide. So let's jump in to the EIR, the Environmental Impact Report. So next slide. CEQA, so this is a very lengthy law, has very specific timelines and steps that the town needs to take. So the town circulated its notice of preparation of a draft EIR back in February, alerting the public, the decision makers, adjacent cities that an EIR was being drafted. At that time, the town held a scoping meeting. That's the little blue circle where we solicited input on the content of the draft EIR. So that was the first time the public had an opportunity to comment on the environmental review process. Then the town went back, prepared its draft EIR, then published its draft EIR, as mentioned, on September 27th. So now we're in this pink bubble. Town solicits comments on the draft EIR. So we have 45 days for public review of the draft EIR. And that's where we are today to comment on the draft EIR. After we receive comments on the draft EIR, the town will take all those comments back, prepare what we call a final EIR, which is essentially a response to comments document, any errata. It includes a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and it's packaged up as a final EIR. The town is prepared to publish that EIR, final EIR, early January. We'll take it to Planning Commission again. You'll see this as a final EIR. Again, that's when you'll make a recommendation to go to town council to make a decision on the advanced planning initiative and certify the EIR. So the EIR gets certified at that time, and that ends the CEQA process. So it's very lengthy and involved. All right, so the draft EIR, which is almost 500 pages long, not including appendices, has a lot of information in it. We analyzed 20 environmental resource areas, basically from A to W. And in that, we looked at impacts, potential impacts of the program. It's really a program EIR, so it's a very high level document. There are no projects that are really analyzed here, but it's a very large program, high level look at what could happen under maximum build out over the course of the 8 years of the housing element. You know, what could happen to aesthetics and cultural resources. And so we found that there were either no impacts or what we call less than significant impacts to those resource areas that didn't require mitigation measures. It's eight or nine here. Next slide. For particular issue areas, we did find what we call significant and unavoidable impacts. CEQA requires that if we find a significant impact, it must be mitigated. So all of these resources either have proposed mitigation measures or saying that air quality impacts, there were no feasible mitigation measures available at this time, given our technology. And so even with the imposition of mitigation measures, there could still be significant and unavoidable impacts. The town will need to adopt a statement of overriding consideration that basically says that although there are significant impacts of the project is still beneficial in that it encourages the development of housing. So these are the resources areas that we found significant impacts. It's not all of air quality, it's one or two resources. Same thing with biology. There's a few biological resources, so we lump them here as some of the ones we found significant unavoidable impacts. Noise is same thing. This is construction noise, and transportation. Again, it's very specific impacts, but you can read that all about that in the document. The EIR proposes 17 recommended mitigation measures to be adopted by the town to reduce or avoid these impacts. There's also proposed implementation programs we've recommended for cultural, tribal cultural, and paleontological resources that would be adopted as part of the general plan update. Not every mitigation measure will apply to every project. So again, it's a programmatic document. Projects will come in, applicants will come into the town with their project at a subsequent time. The town will need to investigate that project at a much more specific level of detail, site specific. They'll need to open up the mitigation measures, determine which ones apply. Some will, some won't. It will depend. The project level analysis will happen after this is fully certified. The great place to look for mitigation measures, the executive summary. It's got a nice little table. Everything you want is in the executive summary. And then if you want full description of every resource, every mitigation measure, they're in individual chapters. Again, it's a very big document, but hopefully you can find things quickly in the executive summary. Next slide. So I've listed all the mitigation measures in the document. There's a lot, but I managed to get them all into one slide, the 17 of them. But there's some new ones in there, like implement vehicle miles traveled reduction measures, because now we looked at vehicle miles traveled under the program, not LOS, level of service. So that's a new change that the legislature imposed. So how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled? And we have some suggestions of how to do that, and those are in the document. And for wildfire, some things to reduce, avoid wildfire to the extent feasible, including construction wildfire risk reduction. You know, don't have construction on red flag days or use spark arresters, some kind of common sense things, but that'll help reduce the risk during construction. Next slide. These are the proposed implementation programs we have. Again, it's very site specific. It depends on those projects, whether they would conduct a historical or archaeological resource survey, ways to protect historic or archaeological resources if necessary, construction monitoring, again, if needed. So these are the things, again, project by project, it depends. It would require the applicant first to come in with an application in the town to determine what's appropriate. Next slide. So CEQA requires EIRs look at alternatives to the project. The purpose of a CEQA alternative, though, is to meet most of the project objectives and to reduce or avoid environmental effects, significant environmental effects of the project. So we looked at three. We looked at the no project alternative, which is CEQA required, and it essentially says if nothing happens, what could be built under the existing general plan and zoning. So it's kind of a business as usual. This is what would happen in the future if we don't change zoning or the general plan. The second alternative looked at the Moraga Center, Ream Park areas and said, what if we looked at more of an employment-focused growth, encourage some more mixed development? It lowers the number of housing units, but it also reduces VMT by putting services, local serving retail uses and such, closer to where people live. How can we reduce or avoid impacts that way? And then the third alternative is cluster the Bollinger Canyon development. And I have some graphics and further slides. Oh, and I think I just explained those. Okay, so no project, again, it would include existing zoning. There would be no development in Bollinger Canyon because that's still a study area under the no project. Mitigation measures would not be applicable under the no project other than what was already required under like the Moraga Center specific plan. There's none of the ones in this document would apply. But you could the town could impose mitigation measures on a project by project basis. They would probably have to do full environmental reviews for anything under the no project. Alternative two, as I mentioned, so we targeted 9 of the housing opportunity sites that could remain as office or retail use or could be developed as office retail use. It could achieve the town's regional housing needs allocation and create jobs and services in the vicinity of housing. However, it would not have the buffer that we have under the project, the proposed project. But we do think alternative 2 would accomplish all of the project objectives. Next slide. So this was a little bit more detail so you could look and see exactly which sites. The sites in yellow were the sites that the 9 sites that would have been pulled out under alternative 2 to have a more employment-centered growth. Again, it's all in chapter 6 of the EIR, so you can look there. And alternative 3, what we looked at is the 51 units that could be built in Bollinger Canyon. We looked at what would happen if they could be clustered closer together, closer to an existing road to minimize ground disturbance and also to maximize the contiguous open space in that area. Again, alternative 3 would accomplish all of the project objectives because the number of units would remain the same. We just looked at the environmental improvements of clustering the development. In chapter 6, we have this nice little table. It shows you the difference of the alternatives. The green means it's better than the project. The red means it's slightly worse than the project, and yellow or the white is basically same. It's the same as the project. So it's an easy way to check to see like what would be better or worse than the project. Next slide. As Afsha mentioned, comment period closes on December 12th, so plenty of time to review the document, get those comments in by 5 p.m. We will accept them to her address or the Make Moraga Home at moraga.ca.us or snail mail if you want to mail them in or drop them off. And again, you can check out the entire document and the associated appendices if you want to see some of the detail on that website. I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, staff, for the presentation. With that, we move to commissioner questions. Commissioners, I ask you to hold all comments or discussion at this time and reserve this portion of the meeting solely for specific questions of staff. Do any of the commissioners have any questions? Vice Chair?
It's become tradition that I start this off, hasn't it? Okay. I guess I know I'm not with the comment, but I just want to say thank you to staff and to Barry Miller and Rincon Consultants for putting this together. This, as we know, an EIR is an insane marathon thing to do. So I like to say that women have been having babies for thousands of years, but each one is just as hard as the last. And that's how EIRs are. Sorry, Meg.
Thank you for understanding.
So I counted 6 significant and unavoidable impacts pertaining to Bollinger Canyon alone. And I'm just wondering, under CEQA law, does this render this parcel sort of unable to be developed? Like at what point is there like a threshold where they say you can't utilize this, and is actually, clustering the development enough to actually lessen, these impacts?
There's nothing under CEQA that stops any project from being approved. CEQA is just a public disclosure law to allow the decision makers and the public information about the environmental impacts of the project, as well as mitigation measures to reduce or avoid those impacts and our alternatives. It's completely up to the decision makers to approve or deny any proposal using the information in the environmental document.
Okay, thank you. That's very clear. Thank you. And then mentioning the VMT, I'm glad to see there's actually sort of an impact on traffic finally mentioned in one of these reports. They tend to avoid that in the last reports. I guess I'm not convinced that there's an appropriate response yet in terms of mitigation measures when they sort of mention, possible programs and mitigation fees and something. Is there something that's like more tangible that's actually going to affect that? I guess that's my question. Very open.
It's brand new. I'll tell you that right now. We don't have anything that really proves that it works to reduce VMT.
Okay.
We have some information and we're kind of still seeing what works. We know how to reduce LOS, right? We widen roadways or, put in a turn lane, but VMT is brand new world.
Okay. So we're all in this together then. Okay. My last question is on figure 4.63, which is the geological map on page 216. The geological units key is just a little bit difficult to read because all the colors are very similar. So I'm wondering if that's a standard color chart or if that's something we did. And if we could clarify it, separate those colors out a little bit more, or at least remove the ones that are not pertaining to our geological makeup. There's like 10 different yellows. They're all like maybe a shade different or not.
I know. Unfortunately, it comes from the California Department of Conservation.
Okay.
However, comment noted, I'll see what our graphics department can do. I also have that note. It is very difficult to read.
Really difficult. And like I said, at least remove the ones that don't include the geology, that are not in our geology to lessen it. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Other commissioners with questions? All right, not seeing any hands raised. I did have a few of mine. And if anyone thinks of any while we're going, I'll ask again. So these are more just clarifying questions on page 211. And figure 2-6. I noted that that there are parcels that are closer to Moraga Road that aren't highlighted, and I'm just wondering if if that is because they're not included in the mixed use rezone, or if I'm just not catching something in how I read through this really quickly.
That's a Barry question.
Just looking for my unmute button.
Do you want me to pull up the figure?
No, I can.
Okay.
I just pulled it up and looked at it, and that area that you're referring to is being rezoned, but we haven't identified those as housing opportunity sites. So because there's development already on those, and there's no indication that the property owner is seeking to redevelop those properties, we didn't identify them specifically. So the shapes you see on that map are the parcels where we've communicated with the property owner and have some indication that they're interested in doing residential development in the future. So there are best prospects for housing.
Got it. So just to be sure I understand. So while they are not seen as housing opportunity sites for now, they are being rezoned so that if the owners in the future did opt to redevelop, they would have the option for mixed use.
Yes, they would be zoned for mixed use, but probably in the next housing element cycle, we might look at those properties.
Got it. Next question that I have is on on page.
Chair, Carrie.
Yeah, sure.
I apologize.
It's okay.
can we go over that again? Because the Ream Shopping Center parking spaces are the lots that Carrie's bringing up, I believe, and those aren't included in the color, and I just want to understand that.
Yeah, so the properties that I mean, I can bring it up if we do want to share the screen. It's where the Starbucks is and the auto repair place. We have included the parking lots. There's a couple of outbuildings that are not included, but those are separate parcels. But the major parking lot area is included in the two blue shapes.
Like around the gym, the kids' gym.
Yeah, so these are the housing opportunity sites, and all of this is this area from where my cursor is to the right is parking. These are the two outbuildings, and then the gym is over here and the driveway is over here. We haven't included the southern part of the shopping center in that, but and we haven't included the theater, but these two parcels do include, significant portion of this parcel is parking. And it's not to say that the other properties in this area are not going to develop during the time horizon. We simply haven't identified them specifically as housing opportunity sites. And I believe, based on what the property owner is considering doing in the next 8 years, it would not affect these other properties at this point.
And Barry, I believe HCD also has a certain criteria of what sites we can use for the analysis and which sites we can count for a housing opportunity site. That's why we filter those out.
Right, and properties that are smaller than a half an acre, they generally don't count as opportunity sites, or sites that have recent investment in new buildings, such as the Starbucks and so forth.
Very helpful.
Yeah, and then the other
Commissioner Helper, did that answer your?
the other comment is the properties that you see that are shaded, we have active interest from the property owner. When we did our early outreach with the housing element project.
Got it.
So like the site that you see on there, that's like a dark purple site, E4. That's also one that a property owner has actively stated that they're interested in redeveloping.
And that's the empty lot next to the 7-Eleven.
Correct.
Got it.
And same with the St. Mary's site.
All right. Any other follow-ups on that, or move on to my next question? Next question that I had, and this is like probably an easy one for you to tell me no, because I don't think we're changing anything here. This is page 4.4-8, where under policy CD 7.1 designation of historic resource. It just seemed the only thing in here that seemed to be glaring that was missing was the Ream Theater. So clearly that's a policy that would need to be set by the council. Is there a specific reason the Ream Theater wasn't listed in there, or a reason why we should not list it in there?
This is your existing policy?
Yes.
I was going to say, I don't believe that it's been formally designated as a historic building. So the only properties that would be showing up there would be properties that have some kind of official formal designation or recognition. And I know that's been discussed, but it hasn't happened.
Do the other buildings actually have any designation? I didn't think they did. I didn't think we had any officially designated historic buildings in Moraga.
Remember, this is from 2002. This is your policy. So
Got it. All right. That was
it's
just
20
my
years
question.
old.
Yeah, I just saw something that stood out there and I wanted to ask a question about
Understood.
it. Thank you. And then my next question is, this is probably, I think, just something that's two data sets that don't jive with each other. On page 4.2 12-1 in the second paragraph, it says that Moraga is estimated to have 5,920 households by 2040, but the table immediately above it says we currently have 5,932 households. Is that just data sets that don't match up?
Correct. Yeah, those are data sets that don't match up. And there are a couple of cases where we scratched our heads looking at those numbers and thought, wait, how did they get that when this data source says this? And projections 2040 says something different than projections 2050. And so there are these competing data sets. So if there's a discrepancy that we can clarify through a footnote, we can add something like that.
And the Department of Finance numbers, I think, is what the table's based on. So that's probably more accurate because they know who's paying taxes.
They tend
Somewhat.
to-
The
yeah.
traffic model was also based off this traffic demand model, which didn't have the same numbers. So
Got it.
we tried our best to make all the numbers match, but it's difficult.
Thank you. And this is a question that I wanted just to have the answer in the record. On page 4.17-7 is the fire hazard map, which is the whole page. Is this based on new data, or is this the same data that we've seen several times, which I think dates back 15 years or so?
I believe it's the existing fire hazard map and not the draft proposed new fire hazard map that's included there.
Got it. Okay, and then the last question I think that I have hits off of some of the discussion the vice chair had with regards to the transportation impacts. Would large scale infrastructure improvements like new roads, connecting existing roads be addressed? Should they be addressed by this EIR, or would those be addressed in the future when specific projects are proposed?
They would be addressed in future projects because they're not affected by the build out, the housing and such. You'd have a document that just covers if you have road improvements you're looking to do.
Thank you. That was the last question that I had. Do any commissioners have any other follow-ups before we move on to public comment? I don't see any hands raised, so I will.
Terry,
Oh, yes.
I've got a follow-up question to your question.
Yeah, please
In
proceed.
terms of that, how about any considerations to road improvements that would be necessary in order to build anything, period? In other
Well-
words, any project back in Bollinger Canyon, potential road improvements that would need to be made.
Typically, we don't look at those anymore because those were from level of service. We looked at road improvements required to reduce congestion. Now we look at vehicle miles traveled. So we're trying to reduce how far people drive.
Right.
However, if for some reason a project comes in, project level analysis comes in, and it looks like there needs to be some ingress egress improvements or possibly road widening because the fire department says they can't get in and out, maybe it's a large enough development, that would have to be looked at a project level environmental analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question. Any other questions before we move on to public comment? All right, at this time, we will open the hearing for public comment as it pertains to this specific item. If anyone from the public wishes to speak on the item, please utilize the raise hand feature of this webinar and we will call on you. And remember to state your name and address for the record. You will be given 3 minutes. Do we have any hands raised? Seeing none, we will close public comment. And now we can move to the commissioner comments. Do any commissioners have any comments that they'd like to add to the record at this point? Seeing none, I would just like to really thank staff and our consultants for all the work that you've done on this. As the vice chair indicated, this is, I mean, I was kind of shocked when I saw the telephone book that was delivered on my porch, but it was very useful and informational. And I got to joke with my wife. I even got to tell like what the beginning of the Holocene era in part of here, which very informative. So thank you for the document. Moving on now to item 2 in our public hearings, and this one is a mouthful to describe. So this is a public hearing to receive an informational report on inclusionary housing requirements for new residential development, and continue a public hearing to consider adoption of resolution 12-2022, recommending the town council adopt an ordinance adding chapter 8-180 to the Moraga Municipal Code, creating an affordable housing requirement for new residential development. I believe staff has a presentation. Director Hamid, is there anything you'd like to say before the presentation?
Yes, just a couple minutes. I've texted Commissioner Thiel. Oh, and there he is. Okay, great. So Commissioner Thiel is rejoining the meeting. So tonight we're doing an overview of a really important topic, inclusionary housing. We've had a couple bites at this already. We discussed this back in May of 2022. And at that time, you know, council wanted just more direction. There was a joint meeting in May of 2022. And we had discussed it with other topics. So we came back to council in August, and the general direction from council was to move forward with a townwide inclusionary ordinance and do 10%. Tonight, what we're doing is providing you a overview, and then we will put together a draft for Monday, November 14th. We'll have a special meeting to review the draft ordinance. It will also go to council as an informational item first, and then 2 meetings for council to review the ordinance. And we'd like to get it drafted. We'd like to get it adopted prior to the end of the year. And of course, this is part of the Comprehensive Advanced Planning Initiative. The state has a opt-in for developers, which is a density bonus. We are doing what other towns and cities are doing, which is a required affordable housing component with 10% inclusionary. And we did have a developer roundtable meeting to get feedback from developers, and that occurred on October 20th. And I thought that we got some really good comments, and we had a healthy discussion with them. So tonight I will let our consultant, Barry Miller, provide the overview of the inclusionary housing and what's being considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Afsha, and good evening, commissioners. We'll start off here at the beginning. Some of you may have seen the presentation we did for the town council on August 24th. It's similar to this presentation in that we're starting off with kind of a high-level overview of what inclusionary zoning is and what are the different components and the decisions that we have to make in drafting an inclusionary housing policy or ordinance. And so we've adapted that for the commission. And as Afsha said, we'll be returning to you next week with the actual ordinance itself. So in a nutshell, the housing element itself includes a policy to adopt an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And this is being undertaken as part of the planning initiative. We have drafted an ordinance at this point, and we're breaking this down into the 2 components that you see here. So you'll have tonight's meeting and then continue the public hearing to next Monday evening, at which time you'll be asked to consider a resolution recommending that the council adopt an ordinance. So this, as Afsha said, is a locally adopted ordinance. Inclusionary zoning is not something that's mandated by the state of California. It's the town's decision whether you want to have this or not. The bottom line is that it requires that a percentage of all units in future residential developments above a certain size threshold are either rented or sold at below market rates. So as you've heard in some of our previous presentations, the town has an obligation to plan for very low income units, which are 50% or below of the area-wide median income, low income units, which are 80% or less of the area-wide median income, and moderate income units, which are 80 to 120%. These are generally not going to happen without some sort of intervention that encourages affordability or the participation of an affordable housing developer that is getting some supplemental funding. The loss of profit that is associated with restricting the occupancy of these units is offset by allowing the developer to build more and to have certain relaxed development standards that they can take advantage of that allows them to build things that they could not otherwise build under the current zoning regulations. So this is an important tool for what we're calling affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is a new state law. We've talked about this before, and this is really to say that we can't put all of our low income units in a single building or a single parcel or a single part of town. We need to have strategies that allow affordable units to be dispersed in multiple parts of the town. And this is one way of doing that, by requiring that new developments set aside a small share of the total units for lower income and moderate income households. So I want to point out that we're not the only community doing this. Actually, 14 of the 19 cities and towns in the county already have inclusionary housing, and most of the rest are looking at it now or making a commitment to study it as part of their new housing element updates. So this is something that Lafayette has, it's something that Danville has, it's something that Clayton has. Orinda is going to be looking at this in the next couple of years. So it's kind of becoming much more common than it was before. And part of the reason that it's becoming so common is that the RHNA numbers, the regional housing needs allocations that all of the communities in the Bay Area have been given are so high that we can't just rely on the market alone to produce this quantity of affordable units. I mentioned that there are certain development the relaxation of some development standards, and that's because the inclusionary ordinance affects the project value. So how does a project pencil out? What's the profit margin and so forth? If you're having to limit what you can sell a unit for or what you can rent a unit for, that obviously is going to affect the value of the project and the bottom line. If we set that percentage too high, like if we say 25% or 30% of all the units have to be affordable, the project becomes infeasible and it won't proceed. So we may have a high percentage, but 0% of zero or 20% of zero is still zero. So we want to make sure that we're hitting the right number and then using the right incentives. We're also looking at, as the commission is aware, the zoning in place now in the Moraga Center specific plan area allows 20 units per acre. So we're upzoning that to 24 units per acre and looking at allowing 24 units per acre in the Ream Center as well. So we're already adding some value to the parcels in those areas by creating the capacity from some additional development that offsets some of the inclusionary requirement. But there still is a need for additional incentives. And we also recognize that not every developer is looking for more density. So we're saying you can have a density bonus if you do this, but a developer may say, well, we don't want more density. What we want is lower parking standards or lower setbacks or another amenity or another incentive rather that allows us to build our product more cost effectively. So it's not always density that is the benefit. So in an inclusionary zoning ordinance, we've laid out on the slide here what's the typical contents are. So for the purpose of the ordinance, there are a lot of terms that are defined. They need to be defined. So someone who looks at this knows what is low income. That's 50 to 80% of area-wide median in Contra Costa County, and that's defined in the ordinance. There are general requirements and provisions for how this gets administered. As you can imagine, this is something that affects units for not just for a year or for 10 years. The terms of these agreements go on for a while. So this sets up what the affordability requirements are, what the percentage requirement is by income group, what the exemptions are, and what the provisions are for what we call fractional units. And I'll explain more about fractional units in another slide. Next, we have the basic provisions of the ordinance, which is what are the design limitations on BMR is below market rate. That's another term for inclusionary. The timing, when do these units have to be built relative to the project? What's the length of time over which they need to be affordable? So the term of affordability. Fifth, we have, and this is required in every inclusionary housing ordinance, is something that says you have an alternative to building the units on site. We recognize not every project can do this on site. So what are the other ways that you can satisfy the goal of creating more affordable housing? There are other options. Next are the incentives, and most ordinances don't get into the details about what the exact incentives are, but they sort of set up the kinds of incentives that may be available. And then lastly, waivers and exceptions, or enforcement rather. So learning from our neighbors, we as part of this process looked at some of the surrounding jurisdictions and did kind of a compare and contrast of the ordinances for the 7 cities that you see on the screen here, all in central Contra Costa County, and have a series of tables. I will say a lot of our draft ordinance is kind of trying to position ourselves to be competitive with the other communities in this market and making sure that our standards are aligned with what's happening in some of the nearby communities. We don't want to create a hardship here that's not present in other communities. So the first question is, what percentage of the units should be affordable? You'll see that most of the ordinances are using between 10 and 15%. And they typically will have the for sale units, in other words, the ownership units, be targeted toward moderate income households, which 80 to 120% of the area-wide median income. And then the rental units are typically targeted toward lower income households. We have low and very low, and some of the communities have kind of a mix and match approach where you can provide some low and some very low and so forth. We did get direction from the town council that our approach should be based on a 10% set aside for sale units and a 10% set aside for rent units, but targeted toward moderate income households for the sale units and 10% for the rental units. I want to point out here that Danville and Pleasant Hill both have the option. They both create the option of meeting the inclusionary requirement in single family homes and subdivisions by including accessory dwelling units in homes instead of setting aside the units specifically for moderate income households. In Pleasant Hill, they actually require deed restrictions on those ADUs. In Danville, they do not require deed restrictions, but they do require that 25% of the homes in those neighborhoods have ADUs in them. And this recognizes that not all ADUs are being used as rentals, but they're still an affordable housing resource. They still create housing opportunities in relatively affluent neighborhoods that wouldn't otherwise exist. They also provide a benefit to the homeowner. They add value to the house by providing some flexible space that can be used in ways other than an independent dwelling unit for a household. They're a marketing amenity and so forth. They provide a source of income for a homeowner who may be stretching to get a fairly substantial mortgage. And they accommodate recent trends like remote work or families with multiple generations living in the single household. So it's not necessarily a hardship to the developer to include an ADU in the house. We're not proposing that deed restrictions be placed on these ADUs, recognizing that some of them will be for rent and some of them may not be for rent, but the overall net benefit of having this product in our new single family neighborhoods will help us meet some of that demand for lower and moderate income units. So this just summarizes the town council's direction on the issue of the percentage requirement. I pretty much summarized everything on this slide in the remarks on the previous 2 slides. The 10% requirement with some flexibility, that allows the applicant to propose other percentages that have equivalent value. For example, lower income, very low income units instead of low income units. And then moving on, the next policy consideration is what is subject to this ordinance and what's exempt. So you can see here that most of the communities have exemptions for projects that have fewer than either 10 units or 5 units or 8 units. They recognize that it is not that viable to take a 2-unit project and to set aside 10%. What do you do with your 0.2 of a unit? So there are these exemptions at the lower for small projects. The other issue is fractional fees. So let's say you have a 24-unit development project and a 10% requirement. That's 2.4 affordable units. Well, that's not really something you can build. So you build 2 units and then you convert the 0.4 into a fee, and that fee is we've referred to it as an in lieu fee. It's equivalent in value to what it would have cost you to provide that unit. So it's 4/10 of the fee that would have been required, or the cost that would have been required to build an entire unit. And that's something that's calculated as part of this process. So you can see the way other communities are handling that. Some don't charge a fee, they round up or they round down to the nearest whole number. Danville said, or rather Walnut Creek says, well, if it's 0.7 or greater, we just round it up to 1. If it's less than 0.7, you pay a fee. In Danville, you don't have to pay a fee if it's less than 0.75. So no consistency really between the approaches here, but there is the issue of fractional fees in every one of these communities. So this was the direction that the town council provided, which is that projects with less than 5 units, 5 units or less, I should say, are exempt. Projects with 6 to 9 units pay a fractional fee, and projects with more than 10 units provide the unit, but then they pay the in lieu fee for any fractional units above that. You also have the option of rounding up and providing another inclusionary unit, which may cost more, but may be more convenient. Policy consideration number 3 are the alternate means of compliance. Talked about this a little in the earlier slide. The general approach here is we want to incentivize the provision of the units on site. We don't really want to see the units built off site. And so typically what you see in the other communities is that you can build the units off site, but you have to build more of them if you take this approach. In Clayton, it's 1.5 times the requirement. In Concord, you can build off-site, but 2 times the requirement. Just to clarify, when we're talking about off-site, we're talking about you build 100% market rate units in your project, and then whatever affordability obligation you have, you build that somewhere else in the town, but you have to build more units than you would if you were building those on your site. Acquisition and rehab of existing housing is another option that some communities use. You can see in Pleasant Hill, if you don't want to build the units on site, you can buy an apartment building that already exists in the community, but you have to provide 4 times as many units in Pleasant Hill if you choose that option. So looking at various options here, our town council provided the direction to really discourage the option of paying an in lieu fee, which some communities do allow. You can build the units offsite, or you can just pay us money for what those units would have cost you to build, and we'll take that and put it in an affordable housing fund and use it to build housing at some point in the future. That's something that is really discouraged, I think, based on the council's direction. We would allow new affordable units to build off-site, but at 1.5 times the requirement. And the council also directed to consider looking at building doing the rehab and acquisition, but at double the number required. The other option that I think resonated, and we talked a little bit about this at the development roundtable, was to partner with an affordable housing developer and basically provide financial assistance to an affordable housing developer, either through the donation of land or through financial assistance to help them build an affordable housing project in Moraga. And that was, I think, an appealing option because the affordable housing developers often are seeking those additional funding sources to close that gap and build their products. Policy consideration 4 is the design of the inclusionary units and the timing of the units. And this is really, can the units be clustered? Should they be dispersed throughout the project? Do they have to look exactly the same as the market rate units? Do they have to have the same number of bedrooms? Can they have reduced interior amenities? So if there's certain premium features in a market rate unit, do those have to be in all of the units, or can they be not in the inclusionary? So this is, again, something we looked at through the other communities, and coming back to town council direction, there was agreement that the units should have the same exterior features. They should be dispersed so that it's not, you know, all the inclusionary units are right here in one part of the project. We don't really want that outcome. Lesser interior finishes are okay as long as they're high quality and durable. Access to amenities, so if there's a swimming pool or a play area, that's accessible to all residents of the development, and including the inclusionary units. Comparable number of bedrooms, but there was agreement that the inclusionary units could be somewhat smaller than the market rate units. The length of affordability was another policy consideration. How long do these units need to stay affordable once they're created? Most common terms are 55 years for rental and 45 years for ownership units. That is the direction that was provided by council. And then also in the case of ADUs, there are no affordability restrictions. So there's the length of affordability wouldn't be applicable because these would be essentially market rate units, up to the property owner to decide if they want to rent them or not, and at what price. Next is whether this should apply throughout the jurisdiction or just in a focused area. We did look at all of the Contra Costa County cities and the county itself, and only Lafayette has a requirement that limits the inclusionary requirement to its downtown area. And that's because they had a redevelopment agency, and this was required as part of being a redevelopment agency. So we are recommending the town-wide approach. However, the caveat is that you can meet the requirement by doing ADUs instead of moderate income units in the lower density neighborhoods. So again, the focus really of this is really on the Ream Park area and the Moraga Center area, with the allowance for ADUs in the single family neighborhoods. The last consideration we have here is the incentives that would be created. And again, most of the ordinances include specific provisions that say incentives are allowed. These can be density bonuses, which are allowed by state law already. And they can also be different development standards, relaxed parking requirements, and so forth. So we looked also at the 7 cities and other cities and sought some guidance here. I want to point out there's an important link between inclusionary housing and the density bonus law, which you've discussed at other meetings. The big difference is the density bonus law is a voluntary incentive that's offered by state law to projects that choose to provide affordable units. In this case, we're saying you must provide affordable units. So you provide the affordable units, you get the density bonuses, but the opportunity here is that the town can create additional bonuses above and beyond the state density bonuses because we are making this a mandatory program, and those are laid out in the draft ordinance. So we are offering the state density bonuses plus a local bonus on top of state law. As Afshan mentioned, we had a developer roundtable, and we said, you know, what would make a project easier to build in Moraga? And most of them said, well, we need, if it's multifamily, we need to build up 30 units per acre or higher. And so the state density bonus for low income housing gets you to about 28.5 units per acre. So we're pushing that up a little bit through a local bonus that gives you basically 30 units per acre if you include the 10% requirement on site. If you build senior housing or student housing, the town would offer an additional density bonus, allowing 36 units per acre. We're also creating another bonus, which is that we're defining lower income as 80% of the area-wide median, whereas the state bonuses are based on 60% of the area-wide median. So that's the state requirement is a deeper subsidy for those units because it's capping the rents and capping the income of the occupants at a lower level than what we're proposing for the inclusionary zoning program. We're also allowing the density bonus parking standards that are allowed under state law for projects that meet this 80%, or rather the 10% requirement on site. And then the incentives themselves, I mentioned this earlier, but they're not included in the ordinance. They're included in a separate document, which is a policy resolution. And that's because we expect that they may be amended over time, and it's easier to amend the policy resolution than to have to keep amending the Moraga Municipal Code every time we decide we want to allow a 4-foot setback instead of a 5-foot setback, or 25% lot coverage instead of 30, et cetera. So there are the various requirements that the incentives that'll go with this will be easily amended. The Developer Roundtable, which took place on October 20th, we had 7 representatives at the table. Some of you were there. What we heard from the developers was maximize flexibility in your approach. There was a strong call to make this voluntary and not mandatory by at least one of our participants. I think everyone thought the increased density up to 30 units per acre to create that opportunity where the inclusionary units were required, and the parking was brought up again and again as a potential constraint. And then the idea of allowing creative alternatives. So this kind of goes with maximizing flexibility. And this is really folks saying, let us decide, the developer saying, let us decide what works best, and be flexible and allow for some creative approaches if we can demonstrate that you're getting equivalent value and that we're producing affordable units. So that's built in to the ordinance as well. So wrapping up, this is the last slide. We have drafted the ordinance. It'll be published later this week. It's a draft, I'll say that again, and we'll be bringing it back to you for discussion next Monday, and we will have a resolution before you at that point recommending town council approval. The council will consider this on November 16th, but we're not asking them to actually vote on it until the beginning of December. And at that point, there'd be the first and second readings, and the ordinance would likely go into effect not immediately or in 30 days, but in early 2023, after we've had a chance to develop the fee proposal and look at some of the issues around the cost of meeting the fractional fee requirement. So that concludes the presentation. It's a lot of information, and I think that helps explain why we wanted to do this in 2 presentations rather than asking you to absorb all of this and vote on it on the same night. So this is an opportunity to ask some questions and talk through this and hear from the public, and take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for that presentation. And now we move to commissioner questions. As indicated in the last item, commissioners, please hold all of your comments till a later point in the discussion. This is a point of the meeting specifically for commissioner questions. Do any commissioners have questions at this time? And I saw a lot of hands go up at the same time. So I'm going to call on Commissioner Polsky first, Vice Chair next, and then I think Commissioner Maple might have been third.
Thank you, Chair Hillis. I've been practicing my Jeopardy. Glad it's working out. Question. Oh, thank you, Barry, for putting together that report. That was great, and to staff as well. Question about ADUs. Are there any studies about the percentage of ADUs that are actually rented out and not used as home offices or pool houses or personal use?
I'm not aware of any studies on that specific issue. I am aware of studies on the rents that are being charged in ADUs, and what we can expect for those that are rented, what percentage will be very low, low, and moderate income. There's some data we have on that was done by ABAG, but in terms of the percentage of units that are actually rented, you really have to do a local survey to get that information.
Got it. Thank you. I have a couple others, Chair Hillis, if that's okay.
Sure.
You'd mentioned in lieu fees, and if memory serves, on one of our previous present or discussions, I remember that the town does not have the ability to take them in and administer them. Am I remembering that correctly? And if so, what would we need to do in order to accept in lieu fees?
Yeah, Afshad, do you want to
Yeah,
respond to that?
Yeah, currently we just don't have the staffing for that kind of administrative portion. We're basically very limited by our capacity.
Got it.
So,
And what would be a solution if we were to accept that? Would it be consultants or additional headcount?
I'd have to look into it. I mean, quite frankly, for a town of the scale, it has not been administered and something new for this town. So I'd have to look at what it takes, what it requires. It would definitely take several different departments to work on it. Not only planning, but as well as finance. Most cities that have something like that, a program like that, they have a housing department. We don't have that. So we would have to look at what kind of, how we can be flexible if this is something that moves forward. But at this point, we just don't have that kind of resource.
Got it. Thank you. Last question. So if we were to allow developers to partner with a nonprofit developer or nonprofit low-income developer and do a 100% affordable development, would that get us in trouble with clustering all of the low-income housing, or how does that work?
It wouldn't, just by definition, wouldn't result in that. I think the idea is that this is done for multiple developments and that there may be multiple projects that are built in different locations. So this isn't just to create one single development in one location. Over time, we look to different sites in these areas. And I think the hope is that an affordable housing developer, there's been nothing built at this point. And even one project would be a start. And I think part of the process that we're going through now is to generate some interest among the nonprofit developers and start to see if we can build some linkages. But there's nothing to say that it's all the housing would be clustered or concentrated on a single site at this point.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Polsky. And I'm keeping a tally here of who I've seen. So next we have Vice Chair Luster.
Thank you. Piggybacking a little on what you said, Mr. Miller, about the developers not having developed any low-income housing here, I saw that on the list of things they were looking for, they wanted voluntary versus mandatory. Do you remember any of their reasoning? And did we not go that route because we feel like they will continue to not actually do it? Or
yeah, I should clarify. That was just a discussion thread that took place at the roundtable. It wasn't the opinion of the nonprofit developers that the town should consider that. I think they're interested in financing and funding sources, and looking at this as an opportunity to help them, close their funding gap. And that was more related to this being mandatory than anything else. So I don't think that they would have expressed that viewpoint.
Yeah, and I just also want to say that, during the discussion, what came up, and even afterwards, I've had discussions. One developer said that he does a minimum of 15% on his projects. And they are looking to do, they understand that this is more and more a common tool that all cities use. So they are vested in moving this forward. So the majority felt that they wanted to have this, that the majority felt that this is the direction that cities are going in, and they understood why. They just wanted to have different ways to approach on how to achieve that result.
Thank you. You answered my question about the fees. And my last question is, so if a developer opts in for the 10% of inclusionary housing,
Sorry, that's not an opt-in. It would
Sorry.
be required.
you are required to provide 10% of inclusionary housing. Okay, right? Okay. So, because I thought it was an opt-in originally, but now I'm hearing it's like absolutely required. Okay, maybe I just got mixed up. When you then offer an increased bonus density, are you then increasing the amount, the 10% amount, or is that determined before you offer the bonus density?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's 10% is of the base project. Those additional units do not have to be affordable.
Got
And
it.
that 10% requirement does not apply to the bonus units. They can all be market rate.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And just keeping tabs here. So next, I believe we had Commissioner Maple and then Commissioner Bodie. Commissioner Maple, if you could proceed.
Great, thank you. So in terms of incentives, if they do not have to be the same for each development, at what point do they have to be equal in value? If we're incentivizing as opposed to increasing dwelling units, offering a less of a setback for one development, does it have to be an equal amount or equal equivalent for another development that doesn't have the option of offsetting changes and increasing parking, for instance? How is that measured? How do we not set a precedence? How does it not look like favoritism if we give one something that we can't give another?
That is an excellent question. And theoretically, it should be equivalent for all projects. And we're basically saying when you comply with this, you have to prepare an inclusionary housing plan that demonstrates to the town that what you're proposing is equivalent in value to what's being requested. Equivalent in value to the dollar. Sorry. Yeah, it's so confusing. I can't even express it. I think this is why we're setting this up so that the fee isn't being established immediately. There's more analysis that's going to need to be done to establish what that is so that we can understand those equivalencies and set up some parameters for how to actually do that calculation of,
Okay.
yeah. I think that in looking at the ordinances from the other communities, that's not something that the town absolutely sets in stone. It's sort of like you get one incentive, and here's the menu you can choose from. What will work for your project to build the product that we're asking you to build, which has the affordability met.
So I guess what my question is what happens when that menu is not the same at one site versus another, just because of the layout of the sites? How do you then make sure that that is fair across sites?
Right.
Yeah, I think what we've heard from some developers too is that they're just looking for something to help make the project pencil. So when we get each project, it may not always be the same thing that they need in order to make the project pencil. Like some will need the parking, which is what we've heard over and over again. They won't always come in because they need more density. So it depends on how the project, the specifics of the project as well. The other thing that we're doing is we're basically looking at the density bonus that the state has proposed to help us inform how to do the incentives for the inclusionary.
Okay. So then my other question, and I'm not sure whether this is appropriate for this venue or not, but if we're talking about including the inclusionary units in the same buildings mixed in having the same access to amenities, how does that impact potential HOA fees? Is there a different scale for the inclusionary units than there are for the full rate units? If there is a pool, a playground, et cetera?
If it's a for sale unit, I believe the HOA fees are the same, but they're calculated in determining what the sale price of the unit would be. So part of the, it's the 30% of your income going to housing includes the HOA fees. It includes whatever property taxes are. I mean, that sale price is set based on some data about what those fees would be likely to be, so that you make sure that the unit remains affordable at that moderate income level.
And how about for rentals?
For rentals, yeah, it would be your rent plus your utilities included in that figure.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all I had.
Thank you, Commissioner Maple. And so next we're going to have Commissioner Bodie, followed by Commissioner Teal.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. That was great. I had the pleasure to attend a couple weeks ago when we did do the roundtable forum with the developers, and I know that the word flexibility really came up a lot. Let me take my hand off here. So that being said, one of the questions I have, and we talked about it, or it was discussed during the developer forum. One of the relaxed building standards was also height limits. I didn't see much on height limits in today's presentation. What's being contemplated with regards to relaxing height limits to be able to build additional affordable housing in these projects?
I think that the current height limit in the two areas that we're looking at is 45 feet, and the density that's being proposed is generally achievable within the 45-foot height envelope. And so, though height limits would be among the incentives that could be considered, that is, again, it's state law that a developer can ask for a height bonus if they're providing the affordable units, that it would be less likely to see a height bonus request. What we think would be more likely is the number of stories, which is limited to 3 in some of these projects. There we might see a request for a 4th story as the incentive, but that wouldn't necessarily require a height increase as well. It could, but the stories is the more limiting factor there. And again, at 30 units per acre, typically that's 3-story construction, but if there's ground floor parking and retail and other things, it could bump up above that 45 feet.
Okay, that's good. One of the my other question, I just have two. One of the last bullet points on page 3, right, with regards to all the policy areas that were discussed, was that incentives to offset economic impact of the inclusionary units. And I think these are kind of some of the things that we talked about today. And so council direction was to take into consideration the concerns of developers. And my question is that to be done on a case-by-case basis? So as each project comes to the planning department, the concerns of the developer for this particular project will be handled on a case-by-case basis.
I think it depends on the project. I mean, yes, to some degree, it's some of this is set in the ordinance, and some of it is going to be determined on a case-by-case basis. For example, the incentive, we're not saying here is your one incentive that you can choose from. We're basically saying, show us the site, the project, and what you need to make this work, and determine the incentive based on that. So I think each one of these is going to be unique, but we also need some parameters, and that's part of what this ordinance does, is it establishes the rules, and those case-by-case analyses would happen within the rules that we're setting.
Right. And I just wonder, and going along with that, where I'm going with this one is all right. So do we start to think of having a housing department, or having, you know, a person on staff, or half an FTE, and their role is to take in lieu fees, and, you know, their burden salary is paid for by the in lieu fees. And one of the things they do is, because it seems like it's going to be a lot of work, a lot of additional work to stay on top of this. Just my thoughts.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And again, that would be something that we would have to bring up to council.
Sure.
I would say too, it is a hard thing to fund staff positions through a fee like this, because the flow is very irregular with the development market. And you may find there's a year where there's nothing, and then there's a year where there's a lot of funding. So typically the funding on something like this would not be used for a staff person. It could be used for administration of the program, but that would be more limited.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Bodie. And so next we have Commissioner Teal, and I think I also saw Commissioner Helber raise his hand. So after Commissioner Teal.
Gotcha. Yeah, again, thank you for the presentation. I guess my question's more on the percentage of below market rate units and how that might be distributed amongst, say, a single family development versus a multifamily development. Barry, you had given an example of a single family development with accessory dwelling units. How might that play out if, say, there were, not to make it a word problem during a planning commission hearing, but if there were 20 single family units with a ADU for each, say 20 ADUs, how would that work out? Would it be 2 of the units and 2 of the ADUs, or would it end up all falling on the ADUs? Any thoughts there?
If I'm understanding this correctly, a 20 unit subdivision of single family homes, the ordinance would only require that 5 of those units, which would be 25% of 20, would need to have ADUs. So that would be all that would be required, 5 ADUs in the project. And then any ADUs above and beyond that would be above and beyond what's required. The developer is welcome to do that, but you know, and they could produce additional affordable units by doing that, but we're not quantifying what that benefit would be and moving it saying you can move it somewhere else, at least not in the way the current ordinance is written. We have said in the ordinance that creative approaches are okay, and that there are other options to meet the requirement that can be proposed. So it's possible someone could say, well, I'm going to build 20 ADUs in my 20 units and get some other benefit, but that's not something that's built into the ordinance.
Understood. Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Teal. Commissioner Helber.
Thank you. And I look forward to getting the actual text of the ordinance. I think the details will be very important. In the presentation, you talked about in lower density areas, they could achieve compliance through the ADUs. And I know other commissioners talked about that. Have you identified which zoning districts are the lower density ones?
We have. It's basically anything less than R6. I think, or did we say R6 or less? I know that was the threshold. R6 was the densest zone in which you could do that, and then anything R6 or less.
Okay.
So,
and is it R6 and less ADU potential? Everyone else is 10%, or is there a gradated scale where you know, like a townhouse project could have an alternative means that wasn't 10%? In other words, we just have 2 zones, or do we have more than 2 zones?
It's not scaled based on the zone. It's just
Okay.
an option for the lower density zones to meet the requirement in a different way. So
Okay.
it's 10% if you're above R6.
And you talked a little bit about it. We don't have the text, so it's hard to know. But alternative means of compliance, does that mean that there is an opportunity for a developer to come in and make a proposal that is for the town to consider that is not outlined here? In other words, the developers ultimately, have the most amount of creativity to make a project pencil. Do they have the ability to come in and say, we want to do this? Maybe it's not within your rules and regulations, but we think it gives you as good of, if not something better than what you contemplated. Is there a parameters or the allowance for something like that?
Yes, and the way the alternatives section of the ordinance is currently drafted, there's a provision that would allow for a developer to make a proposal, provided they can demonstrate that it is of equivalent value to what the town is requiring in terms of the number of units and affordability that it would produce. So I think when you see the draft ordinance, that a lot of these questions will be more clearly answered.
Okay. And then my last question is, I know we talked about city staff and we don't have the city staff right now. And presumably somebody at the city will have to go through each home buyer that is applying for this and determine them to be eligible to be deemed whatever income they're applying for. But will the burden of that be on the developer or the affordable housing renter, or will the city staff be doing that?
I don't believe that's been determined yet. I know that some smaller communities contract that function out to nonprofits to do that, to screen potential applicants or home buyers. And some have staff that does that. I know, I'm just thinking out loud about City of Albany, which has the same population size as Moraga, has a similar ordinance, and the staff does not screen individual applicants to make sure that they're qualified for the units. That is done by nonprofits.
Okay. Those were my questions of staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Hilber. And I think that rounds it down to me. And I just had two quick questions that came from the discussion. One was on incentives. Barry, it was your slide 21, which referenced a local bonus for student housing. My memory of student housing was that it doesn't count towards our RHNA unless it is mixed family or faculty housing. Was the proposal for that incentive that it was for mixed or just strictly student housing?
We were trying to match the definition of student housing that's defined in the state density bonus law. So I trying to know, it was independent living units, and I'm sure that they were available to, we would have structured it so that they were available to be counted as RHNA units.
Okay,
That's kind of our goal here.
I just was looking at that. I was like, wait a minute. I remember you said that didn't qualify. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to double check. The other question that I had, and I think this one's probably for Afshan. So I know that when the council discussed what to do with the Palos Colorados funds, specifically for the pension issue, they had the pension trust fund was transferred, I believe, to an outside company to manage for the town. If we were to establish a housing trust fund similar, are there companies out there that would be able to provide the staff support for that so that we didn't have to have that in-house?
Yeah, again, that's something that we would need to bring up to council as a policy direction, if that's what they want to do.
Got it.
The first question is, would council want to establish an in-move fee? And then we would need to have that discussion and bring back the research and the information.
Got it. Those are my only two questions. So do any commissioners have any other follow-ups before we go to public comment? Not seeing any. At this time, we will open the hearing for public comment. If anyone in the public wishes to speak on this particular item, please utilize the raise hand feature of this webinar and we will call on you. And remember to state your name and address for the record. You will be given 3 minutes. Looking over at our attendees, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so we will close public comment. And now we can bring it back to commissioner comments. Do any commissioners have any comments they'd like to add? I see Commissioner Bodie.
Thank you. Only one comment. And I brought this up a few times. So oftentimes when we're compared to other municipalities, and it's very helpful that exists, but you know, I spent or not an afternoon, but one of these afternoons, I was just reading through a lot of stuff. I'm like, man, you know what? We're always being compared to like Orinda or Lafayette, and I feel like a lot of times the macros of these towns, either with them having a developed downtown, having them, you know, access to freeways and or access to BART, you know, and I really looked at the map, right, you know, of the Bay Area and, you know, around us. And I thought, you know, based on the size of Moraga, based on the location, I mean, I think we are like a Clayton, that was clear. But, you know, you look at other towns, we're probably also more like a Fairfax than like a San Anselmo. So this is just a comment, you know, oftentimes, you know, when you look at the macros of a town where it's located, the access in terms of just, you know, access to, you know, like the BART, that to me would be helpful. And I looked at the size of the towns as well, right? Kind of like, all right, the size of Moraga, population wise, where it's located. So just, you know, maybe like for future comparisons, that to me would be helpful. That's my only comment.
Thank you, Commissioner Bodie. And next we have Commissioner Helber, followed by Commissioner Polsky.
I appreciate that staff is looking into this and reaching out to the developer community, and has definitely heard, I think, from the developer community that the more flexibility the town provides, the more successful will be. I think I've said in the past, my biggest concern is that we adopt something with the best intentions and we end up adversely affecting future development within the town. I don't think it's any secret that we're headed into a downturn in the economy, and including affordable housing as a requirement will make things more expensive to develop within the town. And I just question if now is the right time to do this. And if we are going to do it, I would recommend that we do it in a focused fashion and apply it to those zones that we are giving a benefit to through an upzone, and do a scale down the further away from those benefits that we provide, or not have it apply at all to those zones that aren't being upzoned. That's my personal opinion. But I think I look forward to seeing the details and us to cautiously review everything and think about all the implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Helber. Commissioner Polsky.
Thank you, Chair Hillis. I would like to commend the town and the staff for the Developers Forum. I attended. I thought it was phenomenal. I would strongly encourage everyone on here, if you have not watched it, to watch it. You know, just watching the news, and I think it's probably towns that are fighting this that are the ones that get the articles written about them, but it sure seems like a lot of the state of California is just putting up a big stop sign and saying, you know, we don't want to do this and not in our backyard. And I think what we're doing is showing a willingness to listen to developers, a willingness to meet our fair share. And I think it's great. And I think, you know, the town is to be commended based on the outreach that we've done and the willingness that we've done to listen. I want to highlight a couple things that a couple notes that I took during the roundtable. just so we can get this in public record, I guess, for those that did not watch. So definitely a consensus that more density is required. As Mr. Miller had mentioned, 30 units per acre was what we heard. We did hear in lieu fees were preferred to providing on-site inclusionary housing. So I do think we should strongly consider looking at accommodating those. One thing that we heard from the nonprofit developers was that their minimum project size was 50 units, which I thought was really eye-opening. And typically they look for a 50 to 80 unit project. So something that I think we need to keep in mind. And then the absolute number one thing was that certainty is paramount for these developers. We can't have code or guidelines that are up for interpretation. They need certainty, or else they're just going to go to the next town. And I think being the town that we are, we're kind of at the end of the road, and have traditionally put up a difficult air. And so folks are just going to move on. And I don't think that's good for anyone. So again, commending what we've done thus far to show that we are open for business. I've been fairly vocal on these meetings that I'd like to see things happen in this town and things happen for the better. The last comment, so ADUs, one of the developers made a comment. I think it was the developer from Danville, who was sitting on the right-hand side of the room, mentioned that instead of building ADUs when they build single-family developments, one of the ways that they can provide inclusionary housing is on a corner lot, essentially putting a townhome there. And I really liked that idea. And, I asked a little bit of a leading question, but I do not think ADUs are the answer for inclusionary housing. I think they're the answer for getting a pool house. And so I would like to see us consider alternatives than just allowing for ADUs to be developed. That is all.
Thank you, Commissioner Polsky. I see Vice Chair Lester.
Wasn't going to say anything, but I remembered that I think last time we discussed this, I just want to briefly reiterate, since you're working on that draft ordinance, that it would be nice to see some sort of public transportation requirement associated with the inclusionary housing, because again, it's hard to get to Moraga in and out. And you can imagine all of the factors associated with living here and potentially not working here, because there aren't that many jobs. And it doesn't all happen at once, where all people come and all the jobs are created and all. So we just need sort of that transition, and just consider all of those things in this giant transition we're trying to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Teal or Maple, do you have any comments you'd like to add?
Not at this time. Thank you, though.
Thank you. Commissioner Maple, you don't have to if you don't have anything.
Not at this time, thanks.
Thank you. So just really quickly, I'd like to just add a few words. I can understand the impulse, particularly if I were a property owner, of wanting this of inclusionary zoning to be voluntary. I think that as been spoken by some commissioners tonight, I think that would really, if we made it voluntary, my hunch is that every developer would voluntarily decide not to do it. I also initially, last year when we started talking about this, I was in favor of limiting the inclusionary to just the sites primarily we're talking about for housing opportunities, the 2 shopping centers. I think that, and part of my reasoning for that is at the time it seemed to be a bit of a Rube Goldberg device to figure out how to make it work so that you didn't have a lot of unintended consequences. I think though that staff and the council have done a good job of constructing that device to help to actually mitigate some of those consequences. And I also, I don't have any data to support this, but one of the biggest problems that I've heard around town, or the fears that I've heard around town, is the traffic impacts that folks rightfully believe that all of these additional housing units can cause. And where I say I don't have any data, if you're providing more affordable housing, and even though we don't have that many job centers in town, we still have St. Mary's, we have Camp Lindo, we have our schools, we have our town offices. We have other places where folks may not be able to afford to buy housing. But if we have these options, there might be some marginal effect of actually reducing traffic by actually providing opportunities for folks to live in town. So I'm really supportive of inclusionary housing, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the final language is going to be. And with that, I do believe that staff has asked us for a motion to continue this item to November 14th. Do I have a motion?
Motion to continue.
And a second? Second by Commissioner Teal. Do I need a roll call for this? Probably. Let me go back to my list of names so that I be sure I don't miss anyone. Vice Chair Luster,
Aye.
Commissioner Bodie,
Aye.
Commissioner Helber,
Aye.
Commissioner Maple,
Aye.
Commissioner Polsky,
Aye.
Commissioner Teal, and I, Chair Hillisum, also an aye. The ayes have it. Moving on now to routine and other matters. Are there any routine and other matters to report? Not seeing anyone waving me down. Moving on to reports. Do any planning commissioners have anything to report? And how about for staff? Commissioner Polsky.
Just like to say welcome to Commissioner Maple. Thank you for stepping up, and we're looking forward to having you on here.
Thanks very much. Excited to be here.
We'll have to figure out the hazing.
Well,
I second that. Welcome.
Hazing is easier over Zoom, so I welcome it over Zoom.
Yeah, but we have to be a cat for the first 3 meetings you're on.
well, and I think we're.
Not possible.
I think February is the limit for when we can legally continue doing these things virtually. So look forward to having these back in person at some point very soon.
Is
Yes,
that
my-
true? So we'll be back in person come February?
I think we might come back earlier, but I think that's the legal limit to how long we can continue doing virtual meetings.
Okay, good. I look forward to clarification on that from the planning director.
Commissioner Teal is a lot taller than you're going to expect.
Indeed, and Alexis, thank you. And I'm a relative short-termer here, so I'm glad that we're going to be leaving with a good qualified contingent of folks as we move forward. So yep.
At what point can we call you lame duck?
think after tomorrow.
Fingers crossed, Carrie. Fingers crossed.
There you go. Any other commissioners have anything to report? Staff, Director Hamid, do you have anything to report?
Yes, a few things. So good luck to our chair tomorrow. And party at his house, by the way. He skipped that one during a call today. And welcome to Commissioner Maple. Really glad that you stepped up, and welcome to the team. And then just an update for all of you. I updated the council. We've been hearing a few things from ABAG, from HCD about the deadline to submit our housing element. It has been confirmed that our housing element is due by January 31st, 2023. So we thought that we had a buffer of a few months, but we do not have a buffer. It has to be submitted. We have to get a compliant housing element. And then what we'll do is after January 2023, we'll probably have to respond to HCD comments and then submit the final version by May. So that's what the buffer is for. And then another thing that we're anticipating this week, probably by Thursday or Friday, is getting our first round of HCD comments. That'll be the 90-day period for HCD to submit those comments to us. So we're anticipating shifting gears after we receive those comments so that we can be responsive and try to address those comments, because that is really going to be our #1 priority.
Thank you, Director Hamid. With that, I believe we are now to adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Motion to adjourn. Oh, second to Nick.
All right, we have first and seconded. And I think we can just say all in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? No, the ayes have it. The meeting is adjourned at 7:51 PM. Thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of your evening.
Good luck, Barry.
Thanks.
Thank you.